अब clinical presentation जो है, it is like what is the difference between diabetic ketoacidosis and hyperglycemic hyperosmolar state. So in DKA, there is absolute or nearly absolute insulin deficiency, which results in severe hyperglycemia, ketone body production, and systemic acidosis. Whereas in HHS, there is relative insulin deficiency, which results in profound hyperglycemia and hyperosmolality from urinary free water losses because of hyperosmolar state in the blood. But there is no significant ketone production or acidosis because insulin is only relatively deficient, not absolute, and is enough to, continue the process of, you say, last time we discussed. Then DK develops over hours to days, matlab, even 1 to 2 days, within 1 to 2 days, patient can develop DKA. Whereas for HHS, days to weeks are required. It is a slow, gradually developing process. DK is most common in type 1 and is now also seen in type 2 and can happen in both. Whereas typically HHS happens in type 2 or previously unrecognized or maybe newly diagnosed diabetes. And compared to DKA, HHS patients with HHS have a higher mortality because there is a higher osmolarity going on, which can affect the brain and cause cerebral edema. So neurologic symptoms primarily occurs in patients with an effective plasma osmolality above 320 to 330 milliosmol per kg. Mental obtundation and coma are more frequent in HHS than DKA because of the usually greater degree of hyperosmolality. So here we are talking about osmolality because we are taking units in osmoles, milliosmol per kg. So all the terms are osmolality related. Some patients with HHS have focal neurological signs like hemiparesis, hemianopsia, and or seizures. Patient can be actually comatose. And that is all because the brain is very sensitive to high and low glucose and all that osmolar state, which is balanced between the extracellular and intracellular environment. Then mental obtundation may occur in patients with DKA who have lesser degrees of hyperosmolality when severe acidosis is present. If it happens in DKA, then that is related to acidosis rather than hyperosmolality. So the pathogenesis is all different. Now talking about effective plasma osmolality, I mentioned this in that table as well, that what is the difference. So urea is freely permeable and its accumulation does not induce major changes in the intracellular volume or the osmotic gradient across the cell membrane. And therefore it is not counted in calculation. So effective plasma osmolality, that is in milliosmol per kg, can be estimated from either of the following equations. Equation number 1 is 2 into sodium plus glucose divided by 18. This is the most simple and easily adopted bedside formula. You just have to take out your calculator, see the sodium levels of the patient and the glucose. That's it. You can calculate the effective plasma osmolality. Then the measured plasma osmolality, which comes from the lab, which you order from the lab, which is measured in the laboratory, you minus the blood urea nitrogen divided by 28 from that, so you can get the effective plasma osmolality from that as well. And for that you need either the urea levels or the blood urea nitrogen divided by 28. It is the same thing. It is just about the conversion of the formula or units, where sodium is the serum, where Na is the serum sodium concentration, but the multiple 2 accounts for the osmotic contribution of the anions accompanying sodium, primarily chloride and bicarbonate, and 18 and 28 are the conversion factors for units from milligram to millimoles. Now coming to the abdominal pain in DKA, why does that happen? Patients with DKA may present with nausea, vomiting, and abdominal pain, although more common in children but can be seen in adults, and abdominal pain is unusual in HHS. Presence of abdominal pain is associated with severity of the metabolic acidosis. Now again, symptom is correlating with the pathology. The more severe the acidosis, the more symptomatic the patient would be with abdominal pain, and this does not correlate with the severity of hyperglycemia or dehydration. Possible causes of abdominal pain can include delayed gastric emptying and development of paralytic ileus, which is induced by the metabolic acidosis and associated hypokalemia, often, which is seen in these cases, associated electrolyte abnormalities. Other causes for abdominal pain should be sought, and when it occurs in the absence of severe metabolic acidosis and when it persists after the resolution of ketoacidosis. So what can be this other cause? It's always looked upon in such cases. Pancreatitis. You have to check the amylase level. Now, if patient is still continuously complaining of pain, there is no severe acidosis, there is no severe dehydration, you are not able to find other cause, then you should look for other causes of acute abdominal pain. You should always look for them. There can be pancreatitis, there can be appendicitis, cholecystitis, any possibility, and renal colic, UTI related, and there can be many causes, and you should look for these causes as well. If the patient has a DKA, it is not the only thing that the patient has. The patient may have MI, patient can have sepsis and other issues, so you should look for them as well. Now, other features on the physical examination would include signs of volume depletion, including decreased skin turgor, dry axilla and oral mucosa, low jugular venous pressure, and if severe, then hypotension. Patient can be in shock. Neurological findings can be seen in patients with HHS, as previously discussed. Patients with DK may have a fruity odor and deep respirations reflecting the compensatory hyperventilation, that is the Kussmaul respirations. Fever is rare, even in the presence of infection, because of peripheral vasoconstriction due to hypovolemia. So you may be misled from the point that patient is not running fever, he or she may not have the any associated sepsis or any associated, underlying infection. Now, talking about the overlapping syndromes, I had discussed in the earlier slides that the DK and HHS are actually the extreme ends of the spectrum of this hyperglycemic crisis, though they can be present in the same patient, and they can be overlapping syndromes. DK usually happens in younger and type 1 diabetic patients, HHS in type 2 patients, older patients. DK has no hyperosmolality, which goes in favor of HHS. Volume depletion is present in both cases. Electrolyte disturbances are present in both, and more severe acidosis or acidosis seen really in DK rather than HHS. These are the differences. Now coming to the laboratory evaluation, and we'll discuss them in detail in the coming slides. Obviously, you have to check the serum glucose, serum electrolytes with the calculation of anion gap, blood urea nitrogen, creatinine, looking into the renal functions, then complete blood count with differential to see any underlying raised WBC count and sepsis or infection. Urinalysis and urine ketones by dipstick, plasma osmolality, serum ketones if urine ketones are present, in AVGs if urine ketones or anion gap are present. So in our setup, we are lacking the evaluation of serum ketones. We don't have serum ketones available, and even many labs do not calculate the plasma osmolality. So these two options are lacking in our setup, in most of our setups, but sometimes you can, plasma osmolality is done in AKU and I think other labs as well, but most majority it's not available everywhere. Then you need to see the ECG to look for any underlying MI or ischemic event in a slightly middle to old age patient, and effect of any electrolyte on the electrical rhythm. Cultures of urine, sputum, and blood, serum lipase and amylase to rule out the pancreatitis, and chest X-ray could be performed on a case-by-case basis. So all these things are not necessary to perform in all patients, but sometimes you have to order in complicated cases. If you're not reaching a particular cause or etiology, then you may order these tests. Measurement of hemoglobin A1C may be useful in determining whether the acute episode is the culmination of an evolutionary process in previously undiagnosed or poorly controlled diabetes, or a truly acute episode in an otherwise well-controlled patient. So a sudden recent event has happened which has led to such a crisis, or it was a patient has not been taking insulin on a regular basis or any or other anti-hyperglycemic treatment, or patient has developed a non-compliant behavior with the medication and so on. Importance of osmotic diuresis. Rise in plasma osmolality in DKA and HHS is due to rise in serum glucose. The marked hyperosmolality seen in HHS is due to glucose-induced osmotic diuresis that causes water loss in excess of sodium and potassium. So now the diabetic patient who has ESRD can develop severe hyperglycemia exceeding 1000 to 1500 milligram per deciliter with little or no osmotic diuresis, because patient does not have a good GFR, right? Little rise in plasma osmolality with hyponatremia and few or no neurologic symptoms. So they are very tricky patients, and patient will be having such high level of glucose, still patient would not be clinically symptomatic. Okay, they will have no neurological symptoms despite having hyponatremia, hyperosmolality still. So they are very tricky patient, and you can be misguided, and you may be giving a lot of insulin to them to control this 1000, 1500 glucose, and may actually cause hypoglycemia in the in the next phase. The presence of stupor or coma in diabetic patients with an effective plasma osmolality less than 320 demands immediate consideration of other causes of mental status change. So although the osmolality, hyperglycemia is the reason in the patient with such hyperglycemic crisis to have the stuporous state or coma, but you must keep in mind if these values are normal, especially the osmolality in HHS and the anion gap in DKA, then you should look for other causes. Serum glucose concentration frequently exceeds 1000 in HHS, but is generally between 1800, below 800 in DKA. So it's not very high in DKA because glucagon response is also not very much robust. Euglycemic DKA can still have serum glucose normal or near normal, but the patient requires insulin therapy for the clearance of ketoacidosis. I've explained this in the pathogenesis earlier. Coming to the serum ketones, testing for serum ketones is performed if urine testing is positive using nitroprusside acid test tablets or reagent sticks. A 4+ reaction with serum diluted 1:1 is strongly suggestive of ketoacidosis. Now, why are they explaining this in detail? Because there can be lab errors and you may be misled. So you should know how the procedure is performed so that you can cross-check with the lab as well if this is performed in this way or not. What is the first ketone body which is formed? That is acetoacetic acid. That is converted either into beta hydroxybutyrate or decarboxylated into acetone. Acetone gets exhaled out through the cosmos respiration, which happens in DKA, whereas beta hydroxybutyrate is the one which exerts its acidic effect or increase anion gap. So that is the reason of acidosis in DKA. So this is how it happens. Okay, this is how it is measured, and this acid test जो nitroprusside reaction है, this is testing the acetoacetic acid and acetone, not beta hydroxybutyrate. Okay, for that, the beta hydroxybutyrate can be directly measured in the blood and through monitors available at the bedside, but the assay availability is limited. So if you have, like we have glucose strips testing at the point of care testing available at the bedside for glucose, in some hospitals, in some setups, there are point of care testing for this beta hydroxybutyrate at the bedside, which help in immediate assessment if that the patient is now getting normalized from, or the anion gap is closing, the acidosis is getting resolved. So we don't have that. Otherwise it would have been much easier to deal with such patients. There can be false negative results during ketones. Nitroprusside reacts with acetoacetate and acetone, but not with beta hydroxybutyrate. It is therefore possible to have a negative serum nitroprusside reaction in the presence of severe ketosis, because most of the ketone bodies are now in the beta hydroxybutyrate form. But the test is supposed to detect acetoacetate and acetone. So it is unable to detect and will give negative result that urine ketones is negative. Indirect method is to add a few drops of hydrogen peroxide to a urine specimen. This will not enzymatically convert beta hydroxybutyrate to acetoacetate, which will then be detectable by nitroprusside. So these are so important, points to consider in a lab environment. If you are, sometime, if ever you get a chance to visit, you can check these things if they are really happening. Coming to the false positive results, sulfhydryl drugs such as captopril, penicillamine, and mesna interact with the nitroprusside reagent and can lead to false positive ketone test. Thus, a positive nitroprusside test cannot be reliably interpreted in patients treated with these drugs, and direct measurement of beta-hydroxybutyrate is recommended. Diagnosis of DKA should therefore be made on the basis of clinical presentation and on otherwise unexplained high anion gap metabolic acidosis in association with hyperglycemia. So the diagnosis should be remained in your mind. Is the anion gap increased or not? It is a high anion gap metabolic acidosis or not? And there is association hyperglycemia to guide you whether this is DKA or not. Then anion gap metabolic acidosis. The severity of the metabolic acidosis depends upon a number of factors: the rate of keto acid production, duration of increased keto acid production. Acidosis will be less severe in patients who present early, abdominal pain, or an underlying infection that precipitated the ketoacidosis. So these two factors will bring the patient into medical attention rather than the severity of ketoacidosis. The rate of acid excretion in the urine. Patients with relatively normal renal function can markedly increase acid excretion, like in young patients, because they have good GFR, thereby minimizing the severity of the acidosis. They are brought into clinical attention earlier. Then serum anion gap provides an estimate of the quantity of unmeasured anions in the serum, such as albumin, and in DKA, keto acids. It is calculated by subtracting the measured anions, that is chloride and bicarbonate, from the measured cation, that is sodium. So this is a very famous formula. You should learn this by heart. Even patients can present you in your general practice in the OPD setup. There you can assess if the patient is presenting with high blood glucose like 400, 500, sitting in front of you feeling drowsy or complaining of drowsiness and is not responding to your questions. You can check this anion gap immediately, check the plasma osmolality by calculating through the lab parameters immediately, and send the patient to emergency that this is not normal. Keto acid anions excretion depends upon glomerular filtration rate. Patients with relatively normal renal function can lose large quantities of keto acids, which minimize the elevation in the anion gap. All patients, except those with end-stage renal disease, will develop a normal anion gap during the treatment phase of DKA because of the urinary keto acid anion losses. So this is how the DKA is resolved, because you need a good GFR, good urine output. That is the reason we measure the input and output at the bedside in such patients. Now coming to the serum sodium, 10 to 12. Normal anion gap is between 10 to 12. This is So sodium is a very important electrolyte in such patients because it has its osmolar effect in the intravascular volume or extracellular status. Measurement is variable as factors are present that can both lower and raise the measured value. Balance between dilution of sodium due to osmotic water movement out of the cells and concentration of sodium due to glucosuria induced osmotic diuresis, resulting in water loss in excess of sodium. An overall ratio of 1:42, that is 2.4 milliequivalent per liter reduction in the serum sodium for every 100 elevation in the serum glucose provides a better estimate. So you can keep this ratio in your mind. Simple ratio is 1:50 actually, or 1:42 or 1:50. You can take it around 50. So if there is one serum sodium reduction from the normal value, you can understand that there will be 100 milligram per deciliter rise in the glucose simultaneously. So you can then correlate, okay, this hyponatremia is pseudo hyponatremia rather than true hyponatremia. Okay, this is the basic concept. So pseudo hyponatremia. Some patients with uncontrolled diabetes have marked hyperlipidemia in serum. In this setting, each liter of serum contains less water and therefore less sodium. Okay. As a result, the measured serum sodium concentration will fall, even though the physiologically important serum water sodium concentration and plasma osmolality are not affected, because hyperlipidemia is exerting its effect on the osmolar balance. Ion selective electrodes will reveal a normal serum sodium concentration if an instrument employing direct potentiometry is used. So, to combat the pseudo hyponatremia effects and to understand the real sodium content in the body, this potentiometry is the device which is not really available in all labs, and I think they are more specific to the research labs, so they can help in such cases. But you can always understand through these other lab parameters like lipid profile, albumin. They can guide whether the patient really has hyponatremia or is this is a pseudo hyponatremia. So serum potassium, the rise in plasma osmolality leads to osmotic water movement out of the cells with parallel movement of potassium into the extracellular fluid. Since insulin normally promotes potassium uptake by the cells, and insulin deficiency also contributes to elevated serum potassium levels, that is hyperkalemia. Patients with DKA or HHS at presentation have a potassium deficit that averages 3 to 5 milligram per kg. Factors of low potassium include increased urinary losses due to osmotic diuresis and to maintain electrode neutrality as keto acid anions are excreted. Okay, so along with the acid, the potassium is also excreted to balance the neutrality. Gastrointestinal losses can happen because patient may be vomiting, patient can have associated diarrhea, loose motions, and glycogenolysis and proteolysis, because they all utilize ATPase enzymes, and sodium potassium channel is working on that. So all that movement of potassium from one cell to the other and from cell to extracellular environment is going on. So all these factors are actually happening. Then serum phosphate. This is not a very famous electrolyte to be measured, but should be kept an eye upon. Patients with uncontrolled hyperglycemia are typically in negative phosphate balance, just like potassium, because of decreased phosphate intake and phosphaturia caused by the osmotic diuresis. So the concept behind phosphate depletion is somewhat similar to the potassium. Okay. Despite phosphate depletion, the serum phosphate concentration at presentation is usually normal or even high, because both insulin deficiency and metabolic acidosis cause a shift of potassium out of the cells. Serum amylase and lipase. Serum amylase and lipase are the standard test to diagnose acute pancreatitis, which may precipitate DKA. But both are often elevated in patients with DKA who do not have pancreatitis. As a result, the diagnosis of pancreatitis in patients with DKA should be based upon clinical findings and imaging. So I discussed earlier that if the patient's anion gap has now closed, patient's glucose level is also getting normalized, still patient is complaining of pain, having symptoms of pancreatitis, unable to take or vomiting and so on, then you may rely that okay, this raised amylase and lipase is secondary to the pancreatitis, and then you have to manage the patient accordingly. So this is the table which shows typical total body deficits of water and electrolytes in diabetic ketoacidosis and hyperosmolar hyperglycemic state. This is a rough, I should say, this is a rough estimation. It does not apply to all patients. Every patient is individualized accordingly, because patients can be in heart failure, it can be in the end-stage renal disease, can have other causes of volume depletion or overload. So you have to go patient-wise. But this is a rough estimation that usually in patients with HHS, there is a higher volume deficit as compared to DKA. The water, which is usually deficit is 100 ml per kg to 100 to 200 ml per kg in cases of HHS. It's almost double. Sodium is 7 to 10 milliequivalent per kg deficit as compared to 5 to 13, and then chloride is 3 to 5, 5 to 15 in HHS. Potassium is 3 to 5 and 4 to 6. So more deficit as compared to DKA in the HHS and even in electrolytes. Phosphate is roughly higher in case of DKA as compared to HHS, and then magnesium and calcium as well. So these are all minor electrolytes, but they can have importance if you are stuck at some point in the management. Then you should look all these electrolytes individually, and then maintain them and replace or control them whatsoever. Achha, now coming to the treatment. Okay, now how do you manage? What are the treatment points which you have to keep in mind in the more? Administration of insulin first and foremost, and this applies to both. अभी treatment जो है ना हम दोनों की कर रहे हैं साथ साथ HHS and DKA साथ साथ. जहाँ differences आएंगे we'll explain. Correction of the fluid and electrolyte by abnormalities, frequent patient monitoring and identification and treatment of precipitating events. Then initial evaluation. An initial history and rapid but careful physical examination should focus on the airway, breathing and circulation status, mental status, possible precipitating events like source of infection or myocardial infarction, and volume status. So this is the brief initial emergency bedside kind of, rapid assessment, and then the patient moves on to these lines of treatment. How do you monitor? Insulin infusion. Monitoring is through serum glucose should initially be measured every hour, Q1 hourly until the patient is stable. While serum electrolytes, blood urea nitrogen, creatinine, osmolality, venous pH for DKA should be measured every 2 to 4 hours, depending upon the disease severity and the clinical response. So the minimum required monitoring is 1 hour, and then you can space out accordingly. Repeat ABGs are unnecessary during the treatment of DKA. Venous pH, which is about 0.03 units lower than arterial pH, is adequate to assess the response to therapy and avoids the pain and potential complications of arterial puncture, repeated arterial puncture. So venous pH is a good option. Monitoring serum bicarbonate is another alternative if blood chemistries can be returned in a timely fashion. So you can also assess the bicarbonate level for assessment of acidosis, that what severity of acidosis the patient has, rather than through monitoring of pH, venous or arterial. So bicarbonate is fair enough. This is the patient data flow sheet that I had been talking about earlier, that this is how you monitor. You have to keep this data flow sheet at the bedside. So this is a very important patient data flow sheet. I used to, prepare this sheet when I was a resident in medicine in my ward, and we have to keep this data flow sheet on the bedside of the patient who comes with DK in ICU, and we have to, keep the monitoring hourly on this chart and then show it to our professor or teacher when they come for the round. So this is very important and very easy, and you don't miss any parameter in the patient, and then you can easily assess, and it guides you very well. So this is the second part of the sheet, and here you can see the ABGs, insulin, through which route it is being given, the type of fluid which is used, half strength, normal saline, and dextrose 5%, so on. And then, of course, the urine output, which is very important. Then you can mention about the antibiotics or other types of treatment which is used in individual patients. Substitute option you mentioned here. That is for the recovery phase. So now the acidosis in DKA, direct measurement of beta hydroxybutyrate in the blood is the preferred method for monitoring of the degree of ketonemia, which is limited in our setup. During insulin therapy, beta hydroxybutyrate is converted to acetoacetate. Thus, if the nitroprusside method is used for monitoring of ketones in the blood or urine, increasingly positive tests may erroneously lead to believe that ketoacidosis has worsened or has not resolved. So as a result, assessment of urinary or serum ketone levels by the nitroprusside method should not be used as an indicator of response to therapy. Rather than you have to monitor the anion gap. An alternative to monitoring venous pH and serum beta hydroxybutyrate is monitoring the serum bicarbonate level to assess the correction of metabolic acidosis, and the serum anion gap to assess the correction of ketoacidemia. Fluid replacement. The average fluid loss is 3 to 6 liters in DK and up to 10 liters in HHS, due largely to the glucose osmotic diuresis. Fluid depletion is usually initiated with isotonic saline, that is 0.9% normal saline. In the absence of cardiac compromise, isotonic saline is infused at a rate of 10 to 15 ml per kg lean body weight per hour. That is roughly around about 1000 ml per hour in an average size person during the first few hours, with a maximum of less than 50 ml per kg in the first 4 hours. Okay, so again, here you have to individualize the patient. If patient is in heart failure, you cannot give such extreme volumes in a single go. You have to reduce the rate and judge accordingly. When the serum glucose reaches 200 milligram in DKA or 250 to 300 in HHS, the IV saline solution is switched to dextrose and saline, and it may be possible to decrease the insulin infusion rate to 0.02 to 0.05 units per kg per hour. So initially you give around 0.1 unit per kg. I think I'll come into that. In patients with renal or cardiac compromise, more frequent monitoring must be performed to avoid iatrogenic fluid overload. And ideally, such patients should have a venous line in place to assess the central venous pressure, or rather than jugular venous pressure, the central venous pressure is more accurate, and that should be in between 6 to 8, not more than that. If it is rising above 8 millimeter mercury, then you should be cautious about giving higher fluid. Here we come for about the treatment of insulin. A continuous intravenous infusion of regular insulin is the treatment of choice. DKA and HHS can be treated either with an IV bolus, 0.1 unit per kg body weight, followed by a continuous infusion of regular insulin at a dose of 0.1 unit per kg per hour, or with an IV insulin infusion alone at a rate of at least 0.14 unit per kg per hour. So there are two strategies. One is to give an IV bolus and then start with the same rate. Okay. And the other is to direct startly. Both strategies are recommended and are equally effective. So it's up to you. We usually used to practice in our residency time when we used to visit the patient ER. And once we diagnose, okay, this is the patient of DKA, we used to give an IV push and then ask the staff to start the insulin infusion straight away. The low dose of regular insulin usually decreases the serum glucose concentration by 50 to 70 milligram per deciliter per hour. If the serum glucose does not fall by 50 to 70 milligram per deciliter from the initial value in the first hour, the rate should be doubled every hour until a steady decline in serum glucose is achieved. So this is how you keep on monitoring hourly and then decide about the insulin units that has to be given in the rate form. So keeping the fall between 50 to 70 is, you don't want a rapid reduction, because there will be a rapid osmotic shift, which is dangerous for the cells and for the fluid status of the body. So it has to be slow. 50 to 70 milligram per deciliter per hour is enough. So rapidly reducing the serum glucose at this time promote the development of cerebral edema. That's what I wanted to say. Serum sodium, reversing the hyperglycemia with insulin lowers plasma osmolality, causing water to move from the extracellular fluid into the cells, thereby raising the serum sodium concentration. Thus, a patient with a normal initial serum sodium concentration will usually become hypernatremic during therapy. The degree to which this is likely to occur can be estimated at presentation by calculation of the corrected serum sodium concentration, that is the serum sodium concentration that should be present if the serum glucose concentration were lowered to normal with insulin alone. So correct, how do you calculate that serum sodium at the time of initial presentation? That is serum sodium plus the change in serum glucose divided by 42, where the change in serum glucose is the increment above normal in the serum glucose concentration at the time of presentation. That the patient has this level of sodium, and at this level, the patient's glucose should be ideally at this value. For example, it should be less than 200, roughly around 180. So if has to be 180 divided by from the current status of the serum glucose is, for example, 300, and ideally it should be 180. So 300 minus 180 divided by 42, and then you add that into that current status of serum sodium. Then that's how you get the corrected serum sodium. Now coming to the role of intravenous insulin analogs. There is no difference in the mean duration of treatment, amount of insulin administered, or total duration of insulin infusion until resolution of DKA between the regular types of insulin and analogs types of insulin. So they just wanted to say we usually prepare the insulin infusion from the regular insulin, right? But if we are getting an analog insulin, that will be equally effective and will have same effect with respect to the amount of duration, amount of insulin required, the treatment duration, and so on. After transition to subcutaneous insulin, the glycemic control is also similar in such patients who are on analog type of insulins. IV regular and glulicine insulins are equally effective in treating DKA. Choice of IV insulin should be based upon institutional preferences and clinician experience and the cost, which is a major concern in our setup. So obviously we don't take the analog insulins on board. We usually use regular insulins. From the analog insulin, I want to add that usually the Lispro and glulicine is the one which is used in infusions, but Aspart is not. It's not been studied and not been, there's no data on that. DKA or HHS resolution. Now let's talk about the resolution. The hyperglycemic crisis is considered to be resolved when the following goals are achieved. The ketoacidosis is resolved, evidenced by normalization of anion gap that is less than 10 milliequivalent per liter. Okay, and ketonemia and ketonuria may persist for more than 36 hours due to slower removal of acetone, in part via the lungs. So you can keep on getting urine ketones as well. Patients with HHS are mentally alert and plasma effective osmolality is below 315. Okay, it is above 320 that we are more concerned, and we are treating the patient. The patient is able to eat and talk and feel normal. This is how you judge resolution. The American Diabetic Association guidelines suggest that the IV insulin infusion can be tapered and a multiple dose subcutaneous insulin schedule started in patients who meet the following goals. The last three apply only to the DKA. So these are the 4 points, and among them, the last three are strictly for the DKA. If these points are achieved, then you can say, okay, now the patient can be switched to sub-Q insulin. Serum glucose is below 200 in DKA or 250 to 300 in the HHS. Serum anion gap is less than 12 or less than the upper limit of normal for the local lab. For example, if a lab is calculating the anion gap, serum bicarbonate is more than 18 and venous pH is more than 7.3. Obviously, the anion gap, bicarb, and venous pH, we consider that in patients with DKA. For the patients with HHS, we can also calculate the effective plasma osmolality, and that should be low 315 as previously stated. Should be met, yes. IV insulin infusion should be continued for an overlap of 1 to 2 hours. Okay, once you decide that we will give the sub-Q insulin, don't stop the infusion immediately. Give the sub-Q insulin dose with respect to the meal time. And from that time, another 1 to 2 hours are required to be continued for IV insulin infusion. And after 2 hours, you stop the infusion. You have to write it down in your notes that stop insulin infusion after 2 hours of the sub-Q dose. Make sure you write that. Otherwise, there will be no overlap and patient will again develop DKA. Abrupt discontinuation can lead to an acute fall in insulin levels, recurrence of hyperglycemia, and or ketoacidosis. If the patient is unable to take oral nutrition, it is preferable to continue infusion in such cases despite the resolution. Despite the resolution of hyperglycemic crisis, the patient is not able to take orally, right? But because you are giving sub-Q insulin, you are giving it with respect to the meal time. But patient is not able to eat. So then how can you give the sub-Q insulin? In such cases, continue the infusion. Patients with known diabetes who were previously treated with insulin may be given insulin at their previous doses, whatever they were taking before landing into crisis. In insulin-naive patients, a multiple drug insulin regime should be started at a dose of 0.5 to 0.8 unit per kg per day, including bolus and basal insulin until an optimal dose is established. So you calculate the insulin requirement. Sometimes you may calculate the insulin requirement, and sometimes you just arbitrarily start from this 0.5 to 0.8 unit per kg dose, which is mentioned here. And then you divide that total 24-hour dose into basal and bolus components. Okay. However, clinical judgment and frequent glucose assessment is vital in initiating a new insulin regime in insulin-naive patients. So again, this is so alternatives to intravenous insulin. Both intramuscular and subcutaneous insulin therapy appear to be as effective as IV therapy if the patient is not in shock. Now, this is an important point. The efficacy and cost effectiveness of subcutaneous rapid acting insulin analogs, that is Lispro and Aspart, in the management of uncomplicated DKA have been demonstrated in 2 randomized trials in adults. They are talking about, alternative to IV insulin infusion therapy. The duration of therapy until correction of hyperglycemia and ketoacidosis was the same with both regimes. That is 7 and 10 to 12 hours, 10 to 11 hours respectively for hyperglycemia and ketoacidosis. But there was a 39% reduction in cost with insulin Lispro, most likely related to less need for ICU admission. I mean, compared to in comparison with the for the analog, they are comparing the among the analogs now, and they said that Lispro was more effective as compared to Aspart. Subcutaneous administration of a rapid-acting insulin analog is only suggested in patients with mild DKA and administered on the general medical ward only when staffing is available for hourly monitoring of capillary blood glucose with a reliable standardized glucometer. So you see, whenever you are managing a patient with hyperglycemia in the ward, and when you are attempting to order IV insulin therapy in the form of infusion, then the staff becomes alert that who will be at the bedside hourly doing the monitoring. So this becomes, cumbersome thing, and then at that point you have to decide to shift the patient to HDU or ICU where staffing is available in a sufficient, amount. Then how do you manage the potassium depletion? Insulin deficiency and hyperosmolality results in hyperkalemia. Also, even in HHS, despite the absence of ketoacidosis, that's because of insulin deficiency mostly. The change in potassium distribution is rapidly reversed with the administration of insulin, resulting in a dramatic fall. To prevent hypokalemia at that time, potassium chloride 20 to 30 milliequivalent per liter is generally added to the replacement fluid once potassium falls below 5.3. Okay, preferably in a 1/2 isotonic saline, since the addition of potassium to isotonic saline will result in a hypertonic solution that will delay correction of the hyperosmolality. The serum potassium should be maintained between 4 and 5 milliequivalent per liter. So you can take the 0.45% saline and add the potassium ampules, 2 or 3 ampules, if the patient's potassium is coming below 5 according to lab. So you can prevent, development of hypokalemia. Coming to the bicarbonate and correction of metabolic acidosis, overzealous use of alkali can lead to a rise in plasma in the pressure of carbon dioxide, resulting in a paradoxical fall in cerebral pH as the lipid-soluble carbon dioxide rapidly crosses the blood-brain barrier. So the bicarbonate that you give in the form of IV can be converted into PCO2, and that PCO2 will enter the brain and lower the pH over there. The administration of alkali may slow the rate of recovery of the ketosis. Alkali administration can lead to a post-treatment metabolic alkalosis as well. So these are the 2-3 points, okay, because of which you are more hesitant to give alkali in the start, and you are more cautious that don't give bicarb. If we see very low bicarb, it is often asked by the junior students and the junior doctors that let's replace bicarb. So be cautious. So what are the indication of bicarbonate therapy? When do you actually have to give? Patients with an arterial pH below 7, in whom decreased cardiac contractility and vasodilatation can further impair tissue perfusion. Patients with potentially life-threatening hyperkalemia. So these are the conditions where you should give bicarbonate. Bicarbonate can be given as 100 milliequivalent of sodium bicarbonate in 400 milliliter of sterile water with 20 milliequivalent of potassium chloride if the potassium is less than 5.3, and this is administered over 2 hours. The venous pH should be monitored every 2 hours in such cases, and bicarbonate dosed as above until the pH rises above 7, which is the cutoff. So now we're talking about phosphate depletion. Prospective randomized trials of patients with DKA have failed to show a beneficial effect of phosphate replacement on the duration of ketoacidosis. dose of insulin required, rate of fall of serum glucose, or morbidity and mortality. In addition, phosphate replacement may have adverse effects such as hypocalcemia and hypomagnesemia. So careful phosphate replacement may be indicated in patients who develop cardiac dysfunction, hemolytic anemia, or respiratory depression, and those with a serum phosphate concentration below 1. So if the serum phosphate is really, really low, below 1 is too low actually, then you can think about replacing it. And when needed, again, 20 to 30 milliequivalent per liter of potassium phosphate can be added to the replacement fluids. Again, this can be rarely, you hardly require to do that. This is a kind of a summary, you can say, for the summary protocol for the management of adult patients with DKA. So you see the blocks on the top here that shows IV, fluid, insulin, potassium, and assess the need for bicarbonate. So initially you have to, look into these parameters: fluid, insulin, electrolytes. And among the electrolytes, potassium is important, very important, because it can affect cardiac rhythms. And then you stepwise go and, for example, if I start from IV fluid, and this will be like a summary, determine the dehydration status, severe hypoglycemia, then administer normal saline. If the patient is in cardiogenic shock, then do the hemodynamic monitoring and start the pressors. So hemodynamic monitoring includes the CVP monitoring, the central venous pressure monitoring. Then there can be mild dehydration. And for mild dehydration, again, evaluate corrected serum sodium along with fluid. Then you have to keep an eye on the sodium as well. If the serum sodium is high, then you have to go for half strength saline. This is 0.5%. If the serum sodium is low, then you can give a normal isotonic saline. And if the serum sodium is normal, then also you may give a half strength saline, because as I've explained it to you earlier about the concept of pseudo hyponatremia. Then coming to the insulin, IV route is the preferred. So IV insulin route is preferred, and the insulin dose will be 0.1 unit, and as IV bolus, and then infusion per hour dose. And for uncomplicated mild form, you can adopt the sub-Q dose, but usually, we all take the IV route usually. And if serum glucose does not fall by 50 to 70 in the first hour, then you can double the insulin infusion rate and move accordingly. Coming to the potassium, which is very important, electrolyte in the initial hours, establish the adequate renal function output. Make sure, because once you are replacing, you are also, you have to keep an eye on the urine output. And if the serum potassium is less than 3.3, hold the insulin infusion. And first give the 20 to 30 milliequivalent of potassium in the first hour until the potassium is safely above 3.3. So you see, because once you start giving insulin, the all the potassium will move into the cell. So you have to prevent hypokalemia at this point first. Once it is more than 3.3 but less than 5.3, then you can give the fluid along with the potassium ampules in that fluid. Then assess for the bicarbonate. If pH is less than 6.9, then dilute sodium bicarbonate in 400 ml of the plain water with 20 milliequivalent of potassium and infuse in 2 hours, and repeat the sodium bicarbonate administration every 2 hours until the pH is more than 7. This is just a summary of what I've just discussed. And if the pH is more than 7, then no need of giving bicarb here. This is the further slide. Okay, so this is again, this is the same thing, and this is just a summary of the previous slides actually. So let's move on. This is the protocol management for patients with adult patients with HHS, and again, this is the summary. I think we'll just skip this because again, I have explained this in quite detail. Now coming to the complications, and then you have to keep an eye on that. Hypoglycemia, hypokalemia, hyperglycemia may result from interruption or discontinuation of intravenous insulin infusion without prior coverage with subcutaneous insulin, cerebral edema, and non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema. Coming to the cerebral edema, it is associated with a mortality rate of 20 to 40%. AD guidelines suggest that the following preventive measures be adopted. Gradual replacement of sodium and water deficits in patients who are hyperosmolar. Be gradual, not be very fast. The addition of dextrose to the saline solution once the serum glucose levels reach 200 in DKA and 250 to 300 in HHS will help you, facing the cerebral edema. Meanwhile, correcting the hyperosmolality in HHS and acidosis in DKA. Prompt administration of mannitol where required or hypertonic saline is suggested to have some benefits if you see that the patient is dropping his GCS. Non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema, hypoxemia, and rarely non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema can complicate the treatment of DKA. Hypoxemia is attributed to a reduction in the colloid osmotic pressure that results in increased lung water content and decreased lung compliance. Patients with DKA who have widened alveolar arterial oxygen gradient noted on initial blood gas measurement or rails on physical examination appear to be at higher risk for the development of this type of pulmonary edema. Okay? Causes of morbidity and mortality in DKA and HHS. Patient presenting with shock, patient having hypokalemia during treatment, hypoglycemia during treatment, and developing cerebral edema, as well as hypophosphatemia. Patient developing acute renal failure, adult respiratory distress syndrome, vascular thrombosis, precipitating illness, including MI, stroke, sepsis, pancreatitis, and pneumonia. So you have to assess which patient can develop this vascular thrombosis, and then you can start the patient on anticoagulant therapy likewise. What are the management pitfalls? If not assessing for or treating underlying cause of DKA, you have treated DKA, but the underlying cause is still there. For example, MI is not treated, infection is not treated. Not watching for potassium closely enough and not replacing potassium aggressively enough. Following serial serum ketone concentrations and forgetting the fact that it takes time to clear in 36 hours, and you're just following ketone and continuing the insulin infusion. Interrupting IV insulin too soon. Example, patient is not yet eating well, anion gap is not yet closed, and you are in a hurry. So these are the management pitfalls. Occurrence of rebound ketosis consequent to inadequate insulin dosing at transition phase. Example, failure to give sub-Q insulin when glucose is low, or injudicious use of sliding scale insulin at that time. Inappropriate extension of hospitalization to fine-tune an outpatient regime. So you must, take decision to discharge patient on time rather than continue to extend the admission. Inadequate patient education and training, inadequate follow-up care. You've not advised when to follow. So this is a pre-discharge checklist which you should advise the patient while the patient is getting discharged. Make sure that patient has been advised upon diet, glucose monitor, and strip is available with the patient. You have to make arrangement for that for some patients sometimes, along with the associated prescription. Medications, insulin, needles, along with the prescription is handled with the patient. Treatment goals, patient should know what are the target goals, what are the target values when he or she is monitoring. Contact phone numbers, emergency contact phone numbers, medical alert bracelets, and survival skills training and sick day rules are very important, so that the patient know that these are the sick days and how you have to adjust the insulin. You should advise this patient. So in summary, DKA and HHS are life-threatening emergencies. Management involves attention to precipitating cause, fluid and electrolyte management, insulin therapy, patient monitoring, prevention of metabolic complications during recovery. Transition to long-term therapy, patient education, and discharge plan should aim at prevention of recurrence. And these are my references. Thank you very much.